Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning to those watching, those in the room with us and those watching and joining us from the United States, and good evening to those watching in Israel. I'm Jim Byron, President and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all and all those watching online to the Richard Nixon Presidential Library. Today's program was conceived to commemorate the 50th anniversary of President Nixon's trip to the Middle East in 1974. We had intended to do this program live and in person in Jerusalem, but the tragic events of last October 7th intervened. And of course, the tragedies in that part of the world continue, as recently as this weekend with the murder of 6 hostages. Our prayers are with their families today. Some of our program participants will be speaking to you from Israel today as we look back more than 50 years ago at the Yom Kippur War of 1973 and its aftermath, namely President Nixon's geostrategic plan to reshape the Middle East. That strategy took advantage of the military defeats of Egypt and Syria and the weakened position of their primary backer, the Soviet Union, changing the balance of power in the region and allowing for an opportunity to advance peace in the Middle East. President Nixon resigned in 1974. President Carter took up the mantle of peace and in 1978 negotiated the Camp David Accords with President Sadat of Egypt and President Begin of Israel. President Carter is about to turn 100 years old. In 2013, he said the Camp David Accords were built on the foundation that President Nixon established following the Yom Kippur War. To expand on this theme further and to lead into our program today, it's my pleasure to welcome Ambassador Yossi, Israel's former ambassador to the Netherlands, France, and Monaco. The ambassador is Vice President for Advancement and External Relations with Hebrew University, and I want to thank Hebrew University and its Harry S. Truman Research Institute for the advancement of peace, for its collaboration and partnership on this important program. Mr. Ambassador.
Mr. President, thank you very much. Good evening from Jerusalem. Good morning to you. These are trying times for all of us, peace-loving people in Israel and in the United States of America, and a very bad week for us here in Israel, as we buried this week the 6 Israeli hostages who were executed at the hands of the barbaric Hamas terrorists. One of them, Hirsch, was a United States citizen. Another, Carmel, was a student of the Hebrew University, my university. All 6 were beautiful young people who suffered terribly for 11 months before they were brutally executed by the hands of Hamas. And we are all heartbroken as we mourn their death. Mr. President, I'm honored to represent Hebrew University tonight, soon to mark our centennial in 2025. Hebrew University is among the leading universities worldwide. Our doors were opened on April 1st, 1925. The university was founded by Albert Einstein, the most important scientist of the 20th century, and possibly well beyond that, and other prominent figures of the time. We're also very proud to be the home of the Harry S. Truman Research Institute for the Advancement of Peace, and to have Mr. Dan Meridor, one of the most brilliant Israeli politicians, as chairman of the Institute. He is the former cabinet secretary, Minister of Finance, Minister of Justice, Deputy Prime Minister, and above all, a very good personal friend. Mr. President, for former diplomats like me, the brilliance of the Nixon Middle East policy, the Nixon-Kissinger Middle East policy, stands as a textbook of diplomacy in the modern era. Much has been written and researched on the topic. From the bloody war of Yom Kippur, 1973, when I was a young military officer in the Sinai, to the moving ceremony on the White House South Lawn, where I was a young diplomat, marking the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, I think I witnessed the most impressive and effective form of diplomacy. It is, of course, worthy to mention especially the US airlift to Israel after the outbreak of the war, while Israel was involved in a battle for its existence and suffering horrific casualties. Years later, I was appointed Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and I'm very proud to have raised generations of young diplomats on the notion of the unique and very special relationship between the United States of America and Israel. It is an alliance based on commonality of values and interests. We have enjoyed throughout the years a very special relationships on both sides of the aisle throughout the years, and we should continue to cultivate this very special asset which benefits both of our countries. Mr. President, 11 months ago, Israel was brutally attacked by a despicable terrorist organization. The United States was by our side in no time to warn enemy powers to avoid the temptation of taking advantage of this situation. Plane loads of US ammunition were immediately dispatched to Israel alongside active actions to deter the enemies of peace in our region. So I think it is more than fitting to devote this evening to this very special.
The chain is only as strong as its weakest link. One leaf. One leaf.
This timely discussion and for inviting us at the Truman Institute and the Hebrew University to take part in co-planning and co-organizing it. And of course, thanks to the speakers, to our moderator, and to the audience for being here, either in person or virtually. Israel and the Palestinians are going through a very difficult period with no end in sight to the war, resulting in destabilization of the whole Middle East region. We hope that insights brought by this discussion can help clarify what the way out of this situation may be and how regional cooperation might be reached through the involvement of the US. I now yield the platform to the moderator of this symposium, Dr. Frank Gannon, former Special Assistant to President Richard Nixon.
Thank you, and welcome to all our guests here in the East Room and to our participants here and in Israel. We're here today to discuss America and the Middle East in the 1970s, and we're fortunate and honored to have a very distinguished panel that comprises diplomacy, politics, and academia. So I've decided that the most diplomatic, political, and academic solution to a way to introduce them is to do so alphabetically. So it just happens that Senator Coleman is on my right. Senator Norm Coleman is the national chairman of the Republican Jewish Coalition. He was a student activist in the 1960s. In fact, I checked President Nixon's daily diary for August 18th, 1969. And Nixon was at the Western White House with Secretary of State William Rogers, very possibly discussing the Middle East. And on that day, the young Norm Coleman had just arrived in Woodstock for the first day of the music festival. After serving after going straight, serving as Minnesota's Solicitor General and Mayor of St. Paul, he was elected to the United States Senate in 2002. On Capitol Hill, he was a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and ranking member of the Near East Subcommittee. Today, he is senior counsel at Hogan Lovells, and we're delighted to have him here with and alongside Professor Rabinowitz. Ambassador Yossi Gal, whom you've met, is a distinguished career diplomat who, as Jim mentioned, recently served as Israel's ambassador to France and Monaco. Earlier, he was in The Hague as ambassador to the Netherlands. Earlier in his diplomatic career in Washington during the 1970s and 80s, he was the director of the ambassador's office and the embassy spokesman. So he knows America during this period from the inside. Today, he's joining us from, today he is the vice president at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem for advancement and external relations, and as you know, he's joining us from Jerusalem. Dan Meridor was Israel's deputy prime minister and minister of intelligence from 2009 to 2013. As a young man, he was a tank commander in the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War before beginning a brilliant career in law and politics. He was chairman of the Committee of Israel's Defense Doctrine, and in the Knesset, Minister Meridor served as chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committees. He's joining us from Jerusalem. Or Rabinowitz is an associate professor in the International Relations Department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. After receiving an MA in Security Studies and an LLB in Law from Tel Aviv University, she received her PhD from the War Studies Department at King's College, London. Her research interests and publications include nuclear proliferation, intelligence studies, and Israeli-American relations. Recently a visiting professor at Stanford, she is here with us in Yorba Linda this morning. Our subject is America in the Middle East, America and the Middle East in the 1970s, from the Yom Kippur War to the Camp David Accords. This is the official description of our purpose: to examine the consequential impact and effect of the 1973 Yom Kippur War on the implementation of the Nixon administration's foreign policy grand strategy, specifically how the U.S. airlift to Israel and subsequent diplomatic overtures to Egypt, Syria, and Jordan helped diminish the influence of the Soviet Union in the Middle East, setting the stage for a peace process that led to the 1978 Camp David Accords. I think it's appropriate to let President Nixon open our discussions. At 9 o'clock on January 4th, 1971, in the White House Library, he sat down with three grand poobahs of network news: John Chancellor, NBC, Eric Sevareid, CBS, and Howard K. Smith, ABC. It was the first ever such live interview with a president, and the Middle East was among the many subjects they discussed.
The Middle East, too much, some of us in political life have a tendency to look at the Middle East too much in terms of the Israeli-Arab struggle. We look at Israel, a strong, free nation in the Middle East, and we look at its neighbors, its aggressive neighbors, the UAR and Syria, and we see this struggle, and we say, well, are we going to give planes to Israel, and are the Russians going to give them to the UAR, and how are we going to have a settlement between Israel and the Arab states? If that's all there was to it, it wouldn't be as difficult a problem as I'm going to put it. I think the Middle East now is terribly dangerous. It's like the Balkans before World War I, where the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, could be drawn into a confrontation that neither of them wants because of the differences there. When we then look at it in terms of Israeli versus Arabs, moderate Arabs versus radical Arabs, and whoever would think that there would be somebody more radical than the Syrians, within the radical Arab states fitting in that are more radical, the super radicals. When we think of all these factors, we can see what a very difficult situation it is. Now, what should U.S. policy be? I'll summarize it in a word. One, our interest is peace and the integrity of every country in the area. Two, we recognize that Israel is not desirous of driving any of the other countries into the sea. The other countries do want to drive Israel into the sea. 3, then, once the balance of power shifts where Israel is weaker than its neighbors, there will be a war. Therefore, it is in U.S. interest to maintain the balance of power.
In order to set the stage for our discussion about America and the Middle East in the 1970s, I'd like to begin with a brief overview of the Middle East situation Richard Nixon inherited when he was sworn in as president on January 20th, 1969. Ambassador Gao, what were the major issues at play and who were the major players in the post-Six-Day War, pre-Nixon Middle East?
Well, I'm glad you put this question forth because at a certain point we'll want to compare the Middle East of today to that of the Nixon era, and the things are totally different. The world has changed. If at that time the world was bipolar, there was the United States of America and the Soviet Union. Today, of course, you're talking about a multipolar world. So the two main players were the two poles. I mean, of course, the United States and the Soviet Union. Yeah, another basic difference is that nowadays, believe it or not, but there are many more Arab countries in this part of the world that are willing to come to terms with the existence of Israel in their midst as an independent state, independent country, which was not the case then. Since then, we, of course, we made peace with Egypt, later peace with Jordan, and with many, many others. And then nowadays you have a third player, very important, which is Iran, and we can talk about it later. But at that point in time, yes, the main players were the United States of America and the Soviet Union, and of course Egypt, which was a major regional power at that time.
Ambassador Meridor, do you have thoughts about that? Minister Meridor. You're possibly on mute.
Yes, thank you. I'm happy to be with you here. I'm unmuted, you can hear me. The world has changed immensely. Yossi, my good friend, started to describe it. It was Israel and the Arabs on each side, one against the other. If you look in the world, in the Middle East today, it's a coalition of Israel and many Arab states against a new element, Iran, and some extremists in the Muslim world. So it's a huge change. It all started, I would say, forgive me for skipping back before 73, in 1967. If you look at the basic asymmetry in the Middle East, to which President Nixon alluded when he spoke of who wants to throw to the sea the other side, look at the Middle East from Morocco in the west to Iraq in the east. It's all Arab and Muslim. In the midst of it, a very tiny country called Israel, which is sort of unnatural for many Arabs who thought it's a question of time. The asymmetry will make it in the end. We need to continue our boycott, our no peace, no negotiation, no recognition. It wasn't irrational. It looked they may do it. We built might, strength, power, economic, military, and so forth. 1967, I would say, was the turning point. All of a sudden, they understood they cannot get rid of us. We are strong enough to survive. And they began to creep into the minds of many Arab leaders and others that you can't beat them, join them. It's not that they agreed with us, with our cause, but it's a question of what the Germans call realpolitik. They understood reality. And they began a process. 1973 was another test to their power. They did surprise us. It was a very heavy blow to us, big mistake, comparable to what we had on October 7th last, of course. But the end of the war was where we were about 100 kilometers from Cairo and 40 kilometers from Damascus. And they asked for ceasefire. And it was the Nixon decision to help us, not by soldiers. We were not part of NATO. We don't need American soldiers fighting for us like the Europeans, but they helped us with the tools. So take Churchill's word, give us the tools, we'll do the job. This is what he did. It was a leadership decision that was very, very helpful and helped us come out of this war, again, victorious, painfully victorious. And then I think the Arabs understood, many of them understood, there's no way to continue this dream of driving us out to the sea. And there came 1977, President Carter already, you're right, but let me say, it was not President Carter. It was two other leaders, President Sadat of Egypt, who said he doesn't want the Americans, so he goes directly to Israel, by the way. There was a Vance Gromyko meeting in Washington. He said, I don't want them, I want to talk directly. And Prime Minister Begin, against two leaders who took decisions against public opinion. They did not look for what the public wants, did not go for the polls. They decided what is right and went for it. And that began a huge process of accepting Israel in the Middle East by Egypt. Then, of course, we had Madrid Conference in 1991, Oslo Agreement in 93, Jordan, Israel in 94, Rabin and Hussein, the Abraham Accord some years ago. It was a very, painful but very positive process of accepting us. And I think that 1967 and 73 were the turning points. And again, President Nixon, his decision that you've just mentioned in 1973 to send us the airlift was crucial in that sense. Had we not finished this war victorious, all this might not have happened. From the American point of view, I think that Russia is now, there's no Soviet Union, there's Russia, a big problem, but they are not as powerful as the Soviet Union was. America, people may criticize America and be angry at America, but they all want American friendship. And America still is the major superpower that has a role here. And I think that they have been so helpful in many ways, not only to Israel, to the Muslim moderate countries. I can't say democratic, there's no democracy there, but more moderate and more logical in their actions. And I think this is a major shift. Now, of course, we had this last year, 10 months, tragic. I don't want to go into it now, but one thing that is troubling me, and I would say it is the following. Nixon sent us material, weapons, ammunition, whatever we needed. It was a principle in Israel, we don't want others to fight for us. In October 8 or 9, President Biden said he's sending ships to defend us. It has never happened in the past. We never asked others to defend us. This time, of course, the main burden is now on our own shoulders, but there was a shift here. America saw that Iran comes. Iran is a different story, and they intervened in a very positive way. We haven't ended it yet, but the relationship in the future between Israel and America are of great importance. The key, I would say, to the continuation. I don't want to criticize my government, although I'm not a great supporter of this government. I don't want to do it now, but I hope they'll find a way to work together. And when I say together, it's not the old story of we stand alone against the whole world. It's not there anymore. We can do it with many Arab countries. We can do it with the West, with America. And hopefully we'll be able to get out of this quagmire or trouble we are in now and continue the acceptance of Israel process by Saudi Arabia and others, which will be good for us and good for America.
Senator Coleman, what was the looking from the American element of America and the Middle East in the 1970s in this pre-Nixon period? What was the state of play in Washington during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations?
And I'm going to jump right into Nixon. In that, and I say this, we're going to talk about policy, we're going to talk about realpolitik, and Kissinger is the example of that. Though, by the way, he says, I never use that phrase myself. I never call it my realpolitik. And by realpolitik means that you're kind of looking at the interest of countries of great power. It's kind of great power politics is what's going on versus what may be your own kind of a more narrow interest. I think, I don't know if that was as sharply defined in the Kennedy-Johnson period. It became really kind of the symbol during Nixon Kissinger. But I just have to make one comment about the difference between where we are 51 years later. And yes, the world has changed. But Israel still faces an attack that it didn't know was going to happen. In 1960, in 73, the perception from the American perspective, Frank, as you know, was that that Israel was almost invincible. They thought when this war started, that Israel is they're going to wipe them out. And only a day or two after the attack did the Israeli ambassador come and sit down with Kissinger, okay, and say, hey, we've lost 500 tanks. That the Russians, the Soviets, are supplying them with these SAM missiles, and they're taking out our planes, 49 or 50 of those. Kind of a shock, just as the world was shocked on October 7th as to the toll, the death, the destruction. And so, yeah, it's not, then it was great power, then it was Russia, the U.S., Soviet Union, U.S. Today, by the way, it's still Russia, okay, and Iran, and it's still the moderate Arabs versus the radical Arabs. And so, history may change, but history doesn't change if you don't kind of reflect on it and try to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And I think we lost something kind of in between. But if I can I just kind of jump into 73? Can we get there, or do you want to kind of still go back?
Yes, let's because there's so much to cover and so little time.
There's so much to cover on 73 and 74.
You were at Woodstock. You can do what you want.
Yeah.
But I'd prefer to get there in a more orderly way, to sort of build up again for a number of people who don't remember or aren't aware of the details of this situation, of the details of America's relationships with the Middle East. I think it works better to do it in a more orderly way.
And let me just say this: when Nixon comes in, okay, Middle East isn't on his. This is not a Nixon thing. He's not really thinking about the Middle East. You've got William Rogers, Bill Rogers out there. He's trying to kind of deal with the long-term Cold War between Israel and Egypt, and he's got Rogers' one plan doesn't work. Kissinger says, I should have supported that. He didn't, by the way. Then he arrived. So for Nixon, let's go back in history. Nixon came in to kind of end the Vietnam War. That's what he was focused on. And Kissinger was dispatched to help end the Vietnam War, which we called the circle table. That what's the table look like? And by the way, I think one of the reasons that Nixon wasn't kind of dispatched to do the Middle East, Frank, is because he was a Jew. And I think there was some sensitivity. Again, Nixon had one major thing: the Russians were the big problem. Okay, the Russians. Can't let the Russians control the Middle East. We can't let the Russians kind of become more powerful than we are. That's what he was focused on. And Middle East is secondary. You've got, he dispatches his friend William Rogers to kind of you handle that. But this was not the center of the universe for Richard Nixon in 1973. He started with Watergate. He started with Vietnam. He dispatched Kissinger. They took care of that. Still concerned about the Russians. Still concerned about China somewhat, but not. And then Nixon, talk about realpolitik. Nixon goes to China. He was like one of the most, crusading anti-communists in government, right? But realpolitik says, something, I'm going to focus on our national interest and do the things that need to be done for the good of the country versus where I stand personally.
Before we let's then move on to the Nixon period. But just before, Professor Rabinowitz, do you have any thoughts, final thoughts about this pre-Nixon, post-Six-Day War, pre-Nixon period?
Absolutely. I'll cover 69 if it's okay. It's still in the lead up to the 1973 war. Before I begin, I'd like to reiterate what Ambassador Gal mentioned in his remarks. I'd like to dedicate my comments and my intervention here to our student, Carmel Gat, who was murdered last week after being held hostage for 11 months by Hamas. And she should have been here. She should have been able to either log in or ignore our event. And I'm going to leave it at that. So, You asked Minister Meridor about the inheritance, the 1968 inheritance from the Johnson administration, and I'd like to focus on nuclear weapons policy and the prevention of the spread of nuclear weapons, and how Nixon and Kissinger viewed it, basically when Nixon was sworn in January 1969. And one of the important things that Nixon inherited from Johnson was the question of what to do with a treaty called the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It was a treaty negotiated and concluded by the Johnson administration. It opened up for signature in the summer of 1968. And Johnson decided not to bring it forward to Senate ratification because smartly or acutely he understood that it wasn't about to be well received because the Soviets had just invaded Prague, and he wouldn't have been able to get it ratified. Nixon himself didn't view the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a very useful tool, and he actually kind of campaigned against it during the campaign. But in January 1969, now already as president, when he convened his first National Security Council meeting on January 19, Kissinger and other top officials basically persuaded him to back the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to bring it to Senate's ratification. But Kissinger and Nixon were both a bit suspicious of the treaty, and Nixon told and guided and basically gave the following guidelines. He said, allies were not to be coerced, or there were to be, and I'm quoting, no arm twisting on forcing American allies to join this treaty. And this was a very important cornerstone in the Nixon administration's non-proliferation policy. When we say non-proliferation, we basically mean efforts to stop the spread of nuclear weapons around the world. And it was very important going forward because another thing that President Nixon and Kissinger, they both inherited in 68, 69, was the question of what to do with Israel's nuclear weapons program and intelligence they had on it. And I'm just going to give you a quote. So in an interview from Nixon's 79th birthday on January 8, 1992, with CNN's Larry King, Nixon said the following thing. And this directly ties to Yom Kippur, and we'll get to it. The Israelis have nuclear weapons. I'm not going to tell you how I know, but I know. So this is Nixon, adding that for Israel, this was the optimum time to reach a peace deal. So this is in the early 90s, in 92, before the Arab states developed nuclear weapons of their own. So I'm actually going to leave it at here, and we'll talk about the Nixon-Mir deal in the following comments.
Now that we have some context in mind, I'd like to turn to the eventful and consequential years from Nixon years from 1969 through 1974. Nixon's in the White House, and Henry Kissinger is his principal foreign policy advisor. When he was sworn in, Nixon already was very knowledgeable about the region, about the Middle East and the issues. As Eisenhower's vice president and close to Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, he had observed the Aswan dam debacle and the Suez crisis and had been concerned about the way they were handled. In 1957, he was Ben-Gurion's host in Washington and invited him home for dinner with the family. After dinner, the legendary prime minister helped 11-year-old Tricia Nixon with a homework assignment on Israel. In 1966, private citizen Nixon, on a pre-presidential campaign fact-finding tour, one of several that he made around the world, was in Israel. He arrived just days after the Six-Day War began, and he met, among the leaders he met was General Dayan, who was already world famous. I think we have a photograph of that, or not. Ben-Gurion made such a lasting impression that, and there he is with General Moshe Dayan. In December '68, the newly elected president surprised everyone, I think maybe to a degree, including himself, by naming Henry Kissinger as his national security advisor. They had only met once in passing, and at a Christmas party at Clare Boothe Luce's home in New York, and Kissinger had been a close advisor and confidant and loyal supporter of Nixon's Republican rival, Nelson Rockefeller. Here at the library a couple of years ago in 2021, Dr. Kissinger described an early example of their thinking about the Middle East.
The intrusion of the Soviets militarily into the Middle East started just before the Nixon administration came in. And early in the administration, Nixon and I had a discussion of our strategic goal. And I forget who it was who said that the expulsion of Soviet military force from the Middle East should be a principal objective. But whoever said it in our private conversation, Nixon said, why don't you say that publicly and say that that is our objective? And that was very early in the game. And all hell broke loose when I said it. Of course, I said it to give for Nixon's view to be put on the table. But when his term was over, it had been substantially achieved in Egypt and in Syria.
Nixon was an inveterate and consummate grand strategist. He was always playing multi-dimensional chess games, particularly involving Russia and China, and trying to use them to bring pressure on the government in Vietnam. He later said that the outcome of the Yom Kippur War was an example, was a proof of the success of détente. Ambassador Gall, what role do you think détente played in and détente as an aspect of the American relationship with the Soviet Union played in terms of its playing out in the Middle East?
Well, thank you very much. Very carefully to the Nixon interview in the White House and then the interview of Henry Kissinger. I think that there are two principles that should be taken into consideration. President Nixon said that Israel cannot be weak. Israel cannot be weak out of this is my translation, out of the commitment of the big sister or big brother, America, to its sister democracy. And this goes back to the friendship between the two nations. Kissinger spoke about the intrusion of the Soviet Union into the region. And this is what I referred to when I spoke about the competition between the two superpowers, the world being bipolar at the time, the United States and the Soviet Union competing for areas of influence everywhere around the globe. Now, the art of diplomacy based on these two elements was, I believe, how to build on this principle and how to build on the outcome of the Yom Kippur War towards a peaceful settlement between Israel and Egypt. And this is the beauty of diplomacy of the Nixon-Kissinger era, taking into account these two principles, the commitment to Israel, but at the same time, the commitment to stop the Soviet Union from expanding its influence. Another element, and I think that Minister Meridor touched on it, I mean, whenever we reach peace in this part of the world, it was first and foremost an outcome of the very strong will of the leaders here in this part of the world. This is the peace between Israel and Egypt. Had it not been for Prime Minister Begin at the time and President Sadat, we would not have had a peace agreement between the two countries. The same applies for Jordan, and I was privileged to have been one of the negotiators of the peace treaty with Jordan. Again, in retrospect, it is very clear that it was the late king of Jordan, King Hussein, and the late prime minister of Israel. So you're talking about a situation of, diplomacy taking advantage of all of these 3 points that I mentioned, stopping the Soviet Union from, expanding its influence, the commitment to Israel, and building on the will and the wish of the leaders of this part of the world to reach some form of an, reconciliation.
I wonder, did Nixon's hesitation about selling the Phantom jets to Israel, I know Prime Minister Meir was greatly concerned about it, and he kept telling her not to worry, but he did postpone the decision. Ambassador Meredith, did that have any impact on the American-Israeli relations?
Well, the supply of weapons, especially Air Force, to Israel is crucial, was crucial always. And there were a few cases where the shipment of promised material was used as a weapon, should I say, or as a warning, when there were differences of opinion between the Israeli government and the Americans on Rabin's time once, I think on Begin's time once. But we got over it. It was not too deep a story. But basically, back to what was said earlier, in the era of confrontation between the two big superpowers, the Soviet Union and America, generally speaking, the Arabs had the support and the backing of the Soviets, who had no interest in pacifying the Middle East. The conflict was good for them. This is the way they had the inroads to the Arab countries. When, in the end of the story, after 73, even before the war, when when the Russians left Egypt, America showed the force that the Soviet never had. America is a big economic power. It can help, not only by weapons, in many other ways, including money, to speak very simply. Technology, money, modernity. And the Arabs, those who wanted to throw us to the sea, as was mentioned by President Nixon, didn't have the backing of the Soviet Union anymore. America became the more dominant superpower, and in the end, the only superpower for many years. So they may speak against America, but in the end, they want America as a friend. That being the global structure, when there is no automatic backing to the Arab demands on the Soviet side, even Russia changed its views on Israel and came closer to us in many ways. And I think the idea of the Arabs that they can, in the end, win against us weakened very much. And the reason came to their thinking and leadership that was needed, was mentioned here. And they took the rational decision to try to accommodate and to try to find a way with us. And they met an Israeli leadership that did the same. I think the Americans, although they were not always the initiators, not of Israel-Egypt, and even not Israel-Jordan. It was not started with the Americans. It was started directly. And not the Oslo Agreement. That was not started with the Americans. In the end, without the Americans, it might not have been finished the way it was, positively. The Americans were very helpful. I remember their help in many instances sometimes didn't work. I was at Camp David with President Clinton and Prime Minister Barak and Chairman Arafat for 2 weeks, and we didn't succeed. Arafat said no in the end. But the American involvement is very important, both as a negotiator, as a clear supporter of the existence of Israel, even if there are differences about policies, and as we have now, and it may happen again, and that the Arabs need America in the end. For example, they need America to defend their own regimes. We saw it in the Arab Spring, where American policy that I would not have advised if I were there, to help topple down Mubarak and others, caused some questions. Is America for us or not for us? So there was a time of hesitation, from which, by the way, we gained somewhat because I think they saw in us a steady supporter in the Middle East. But in the long run, America's role is still very important. If America doesn't go inwards and forget about the world. I don't want to mess into American politics now, but plays this global role, there is a chance that we will go back to more acceptance and moderation, even if we have now a big problem.
At a state dinner in 1970 with, in honor of Golda Meir, they had a discussion, and Nixon told her that his America's principle of diplomacy in the Middle East was the golden rule was to do unto others as they do unto you. And Kissinger was there, and he said, plus 10%. And Mrs. Meir said, well, if that's your policy, I feel more safe in the world. Senator Coleman, we have reached the 1973, the Yom Kippur War, which, as you said earlier, came as a surprise, and everybody thought that the experience of the Six-Day War would be repeated, and it wasn't.
So, if you go back, some made the comment early on about the commonality of interest. And Frank, that commonality of interest, I don't think it was very clear in '73. Nixon didn't have, Reagan was in '84, he had the U.S.-Israel security cooperation. There was no Israel-U.S. security cooperation. What there was, and I think this is a really important point, people make a difference. Individuals make a difference. You can have all the policies. Nixon, realpolitik, right? But if you think about realpolitik, think about this. You've got the Egypt and Syria, surprise invasion of Israel. They're making gains far beyond what we thought that they would make. Nixon is sitting there, all of a sudden they're told that, they could lose this thing. And again, number one objective, keep Russia out of the region. If Israel loses, Russia can dominate the region. But then the other thing you had is you had the non-involved Arab countries saying, if you come in there, we're going to cut off your flow to oil. Yes. That means oil embargo. That means economic challenges. Richard Nixon is still a politician, okay? And his party is still, so you face that. And in addition to that, you had the European countries who were saying, you can't use any of our bases to refuel your craft. We didn't have the capacity to get from here to Israel without stopping somewhere in between. And as I understand the history, and Frank, and I'm sure you know it much better, I think Portugal had in the Azores, right, and a Dutch defense minister, without agreement of his government, said, okay. So go back. We're talking great powers, realpolitik, interests of a country. The interests of your country are not, by the way, then to resupply, because of the concern of oil embargo, the concern of getting at odds with all the major European powers. And the last thing, and I'll say it up front, Nixon was not a Zionist. He didn't always have the greatest relationships with the American Jewish community, okay? But there was something in his heart, and perhaps some relation with Golda Meir, that even when all this started to come together, even Kissinger, and I got to read a Kissinger quote, because Kissinger, the Jew, right? Kissinger is saying Israel must be strong, but Israel's strength does not prevent the spread of communism in the Arab world. Israel's strength provides for Israel's security. The best defense against the spread of communism in the Arab world is to strengthen the moderate Arab governments. So it is difficult to claim that a strong Israeli serves America's interests because it prevents the spread of communism in the Arab world. It does not. It provides for the survival of Israel. Bottom line, realpolitik would have perhaps dictated a different outcome from what you saw. But Richard Nixon ultimately, when Kissinger, one other story, Frank, I know you're familiar with all these, apparently they were concerned about the impact of the other Arab countries. So I think the recommendation, I don't know whether it was Kissinger or Rogers, said let's send three plane loads over there. And Nixon said, I don't care whether they're 3 or 300. They're not going to be happy with us. Send everything we got. Okay, get it done. And so I guess my point is you faced a moment where the realpolitik of the players was kind of put into play. But in the end, I think there's something about the personal commitment that people have that makes a difference. And I thought that ultimately, fast forward, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because I like to keep kind of chronological. But ultimately, that's Sadat. Okay, that individuals make a difference. Trump-Abraham Accords made a difference. All the folks around him are saying you can't move the embassy to Jerusalem, recognize Jerusalem as the capital, you can't move the embassy, etc. And so people, individuals make a difference regardless of what the geopolitics tell you.
The no good deed goes unpunished, and indeed for the price that Nixon paid for saving Israel was the Arab, the threatened and executed Arab oil boycott. Ambassador Gal, the role, can you talk a little bit about the role of ambassadors in Washington during this period? Two particularly influential ambassadors were there during this period.
Well, just a short comment on the senator's remarks. Of course, people make a difference. And of course, personal commitments make a difference. That is exactly what I meant when I spoke about the leaders of the Middle East. And it is really up to the leaders to set the policy. And likewise, in Washington, people like Nixon and like Kissinger, they make a difference. And yes, we're all aware of the prices that they paid, starting from the oil embargo and the reaction by certain Europeans. But at the same time, in the overall strategic calculation, there was also this wish to stop the intrusion or the expansion of the Soviet Union influence in this part of the world. And maybe I'm naive, but yes, there was also the commitment of the United States of America to a democracy, the only democracy in this part of the world. On the question of the role of diplomacy, well, in my bucket list, I have one mission, and this is to write the ultimate book about the changing face of diplomacy. I refer you to Henry Kissinger's last book, which is called The Crises. And of course, we have all read all of his books. Crises is a bit different because it takes the office of Mr. Kissinger and verbatim all the talks and all the everything he had on the Yom Kippur War. So it starts 6:55, Ambassador Dobrynin calls, 7 o'clock, Ambassador Binitz calls, and so on and so forth. Well, diplomacy at that time was so much difference between diplomacy nowadays. In the meantime, we all went through the information revolution and the information technology, and leaders do not need their ambassadors in order to be updated. The world is instantaneous. Everything that happens in Washington in a split of a second, it's here and vice versa. So leaders talk to each other. And when you read Crisis by Henry Kissinger, you realize that ambassadors, both Israeli Ambassador Binitz and Ambassador Dobrynin at the time in Washington, were so crucial because they were the main conduit to the Israeli leaders or to Russia. Nowadays, I mean, it's a different ball game. The diplomats of nowadays have or should have different qualities altogether.
President Nixon thought that one of the proofs of the pudding of détente was the emigration of Soviet Jews from 1968 to 1971. Only 15,000 had been allowed to emigrate. He began behind the scenes pressuring Brezhnev. And so in 1972, the number jumped to 31,400. And the next year, Nixon's last full year as president, in 1973, it jumped from 13,000 to 35,000. So this was an example of the power of behind-the-scenes pressure. At the end of '73, the House passed the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, tying most favored nation status to the emigration of Soviet Jews against Nixon's strong advice and instincts. And the next year, the number went back down to 13,000. Yes, sir?
And nobody can underestimate the importance of this huge wave of immigration from the Soviet Union to Israel and what this 1 million Jews who came to Israel have done to the character of this nation. And they have contributed so much in terms of education, in terms of culture, in terms of innovation and everything else. But this goes back again to the question of the personal commitment of, people make a difference. And this is where the Nixon administration made quite a difference.
So August 74, Nixon is aboard Air Force One flying over Missouri when Gerald Ford is sworn in as the 38th president. Henry Kissinger stays on as Secretary of State. But in November of '78, both Ford and Kissinger are replaced by a new kind of president, Jimmy Carter. Professor Rabinowitz, can you talk a little bit about the Ford relations with the Middle East for the brief period of his administration, and then the Carter people, the policy and personnel?
Of course, so I'll just jump back in time a bit, and I'll tie my earlier comments to the current comments. So we talked about the happenings and the events in August 1969. We had Woodstock, we had the White House preparations towards the famous meeting between Nixon and Meir in '69. In September '69, there's one important thing to remember. Golda Meir, even though she was born in today's Ukraine, actually grew up in Milwaukee and spoke perfect English and had a very good relationship with Nixon, perhaps because their ability to properly communicate with each other, and there was no, they didn't have any misunderstandings between them. And in 1969, as the administration was preparing for that meeting, one of the things they had to contend with was what kind of policy to implement with regards to Israel's nuclear program, and this will also tie in to 1973 and to Ford and Carter going forward. And eventually what happened is that the two had reached an agreement that has never been formally acknowledged by either the US or Israel, but has been widely reported on since 1991 forwards, and it's called the Nixon-Meir Understanding. And as far as scholarly knowledge goes, we assume that in this understanding, Golda Meir, on her part, guaranteed that Israel would not test, declare, or otherwise threaten to use its nuclear weapons, which is very relevant to the Yom Kippur War, and Nixon agreed to remove it from the bilateral table. And in 1973, we basically see Israel's nuclear weapons not playing a part of the conflict. There is one question mark that historians in the future would have to answer, and that has to do with the airlift, Operation Nickelgrass, and the famous meeting that was mentioned previously on the night of October 12th, October 13th in Israel between Dinitz and Kissinger. Dinitz carried a famous cable, a famous message from Golda Meir to Kissinger. The problem is we don't know what was in the message. And that's a very, we would love the either archives either in Israel or the US to tell us what was in the message. The only thing we know is that it was a severe message. Yigal Allon, Israeli foreign minister, said in 1979 that it was a severe, dire, serious message. The one thing we do know is that after this meeting, the airlift began to arrive. But I'd like to point out that we don't know that there is a connection between the cable, the meeting, whatever was discussed, and the actual arrival of the airlift, and whether this had anything to do with Israel's nuclear program or not. But what we do know is that when Ford was sworn in, he basically decided to maintain Nixon's policy. Kissinger, interestingly, basically adopted Rogers's incremental approach to the conflict. So before 1973, the Rogers approach to the conflict, the incremental approach, basically saying that there needs to be a dialogue with Egypt and separately a dialogue with other actors, Jordan namely, and Rogers basically advocated an Israeli withdrawal from parts of Western Sinai, And we see that after 1973, Kissinger adopts the same approach. We have the Shuttle diplomacy. Eventually, this would, after the reevaluation period from March 1975 to September 1975, where the Rabin-led government kind of basically refused to accept Kissinger's pressure to withdraw from Western Sinai. In September 1975, the Israeli government agrees. The reason they didn't want to accept it, or the major reason they didn't want to accept it, was that the agreement didn't entail a peace process. It didn't entail a peace agreement. It was basically a part of a cessation of war formulation, and the Israelis wanted a bigger Egyptian currency. But eventually, the reevaluation period got them back to the table. And this was Kissinger's last effective contribution in terms of seeing achievements on the ground. But the sentiment, the spirit of the incremental approach did win the day. It won the day during another administration, during the Carter administration. As we know, instead of an American attempt to reach one comprehensive big peace bargain which would involve Israel and all of its neighbors, the incremental approach was incremental. It advocated an Israeli-Egyptian peace process. One thing we need to understand is that, to a great degree, the Americans and the Israelis misread or misunderstood Sadat's willingness to open a peace dialogue with the Israelis before the Yom Kippur War. So perhaps this was achievable in 1972, we'll never know. But Sadat was definitely amenable to such process, and he was amenable to warming ties with the US. Maybe some of the audience either know or maybe they remember that back in 1972, he had already expelled Soviet advisors from Egypt. So the ground was very much, the background was ready. And the Carter administration managed to capitulate on that, even though personal relations between Carter and Begin were really detrimental. And we can expand on that later, if we have time.
Frank, can I add a footnote to this discussion? I think those of us around remember the Kissinger Shuttle diplomacy, and but going back until perhaps the third phase, there was the original one with Sinai 1. There was an agreement with the Egypt, and then he came in. Then there was the Syrian peace. And the Egypt thing got done quickly. The Syrian peace took like a year, but then you've got that third piece, and at one point you had Ford talking about the U.S. needs to reassess its relationship with Israel. Interesting, you wouldn't see that today. And that caused a big stir. And then ultimately Ford had to kind of back down on that and say, no. But in part, it goes to the point, and I think Kissinger was always in this place, that he really wanted to figure out a way to kind of get the moderate Arabs as part of this process. And he was deeply concerned, in fact, and they felt that Israel was actually being intransigent in that final phase of it. So for Kissinger, he was always kind of figuring out this regional thing, and how do we kind of make that, work out. I think he would be happy today, looking at where Saudi is still in conversation with Israel about normalization, and if Saudi does Israel normalization, you'll see probably Indonesia, you'll see Malaysia, you'll see a range of other of the Arab countries not aligned with Iran kind of stepping forward. So I think that vision was relevant then. It was always in his mind. I think it still has relevance today.
And I'm going to add something very, very quickly. In September 1970, the Jordanian King Hussein acted against Palestinian factions inside Jordan. And in response, the Syrians invaded northern Jordan with more than 300 tanks. And Hussein asked the Americans to ask the Israelis to come to his aid. And 24 hours later, I'm cutting the story short, the Israelis placed 400 tanks on their border and carried out sonic booms over the Syrian forces. The king managed to expel them, but this underlined Israel's strategic geopolitical positioning in the region, and it underlined its importance as an American ally in the region, and I think that is still accurate today.
Fast forward, when the Iranians send this fusillade of missiles and drones to Egypt, to Israel, Saudi defenses are in play, knocking those down. Jordan, so Israel now part of that, Israel now being part of CENTCOM, which is very critical. So they are part of a regional military alliance prefaced by what happened a number of years ago.
We're coming up on a 9/11 anniversary, and not the one everyone thinks of, but 9/11 of 1970, the Black September, and Nixon thought that the decision he made then to approve, it didn't have to, in the end, the Jordanians saved themselves, but Nixon had approved Israeli airstrikes. If that were, and even they were considering the possibility of ground troops. And it was Nixon that led him to make the first presidential statement on terrorism, because the 4 airplanes had been hijacked, and I think 2 or 3 of them blown up. And he set up a cabinet committee to combat terrorism, and they produced some very useful information and recommendations, but the issue passed. And so they were kind of forgotten, and then another 9/11 happened. We've reached the end and sort of the apotheosis of our story, the Camp David Accords. In September 1968, President Carter took an extraordinary risk and reaped an extraordinary reward. Here's a photo of the President and Carter and President Sadat and Prime Minister Begin at Camp David. And just before, or actually they were there from the 5th to the 17th, and then a photograph of them on the South Lawn at the triumphal ceremony. Minister Meridor, would you begin, would you tell us about those dramatic and historic events that those days at Camp David in September, between 5 and 17 September of 1978?
When Begin came to power in May of 1977, he was seen by many outside of Israel, and by the way, from within his opponents in Israel, as a warmonger, a man who would be a tough hawk and will never think of peace and so forth. And the first thing he did as prime minister is to invite Egypt, Jordan, and Syria to come and talk and say, let's try it and find peace. Even this was not taken very seriously. Later, I don't want to go to all details, there was the attempt by Begin through the Romanian Ceausescu to tell Sadat there's a way. Then he sent Moshe Dayan, General Dayan was mentioned earlier, to Morocco, and Sadat took his initiative, and there was a question of the Israeli response. There could be an Israeli prime minister who said, big deal, so he said something, who cares? I think Begin said so, and he got the sense of history and responsibility for history. There's a chance that would cost a lot in terms of land and other things, but we need to take it before it goes away. And his decision, when inviting Sadat to Jerusalem as he proposed, and it was not at Camp David, it was in November of 77 when Sadat came to Jerusalem at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, that Begin told Sadat, I'm ready to go to the international border between us. That means giving all of Sinai. The Labour Party government policy was territorial compromise. Part to us, part to you. Moshe Dayan is remembered to have said, better to have Sharm el-Sheikh with no peace than peace with no Sharm el-Sheikh. So it was a big decision for Begin, who was considered to be the hawk who will never give in, to go all the way, not to discuss territory, to give all the territory away of Sinai, and to try to catch history, so to speak, and change the course of history, which he did. Camp David came in September 78, about 8 months after the visit of, or 10 months after the visit of Sadat to Jerusalem. And there's all negotiation. It was tough, it was difficult when you go down to the details, the devil is in details, you know, and the questions of the Palestinian issue, rather Jerusalem and Egypt was part of the Arab League, was the leader of the Arab League, and they were committed not to give away the others, thinking of itself. So they had to do 2 agreements, one Egypt-Israel, and one some framework agreement about the Middle East, which was ideologically very difficult to Begin. I don't want to go into detail, but he managed to do the right things there, and negotiations might have been tough. There were threats to leave in the middle and so forth. But the end was there, and it was a positive one. And even after that, there were several months passed until March of 79, when the agreement of peace, the Treaty of Peace was signed on the lawn of the White House, as you saw, and the Middle East changed dramatically. From our perspective, the Israeli perspective, we saw a wall of hatred around us. And there was the Arab unity idea, which obliged the Arabs to stay together. And the fact that we were able to take outside this wall of hatred, the main brick, so to speak, the biggest, strongest, most influential Arab country, Egypt, and not by disengagement or ceasing hostility, but really to make peace, recognizing Israel and ending the conflict, was a major story that really changed the Middle East. Militarily, there was no threat of war of all fronts anymore, and it began a process that, as we said earlier, allowed many more Arabs to come into the circle of accommodation with Israel, normalization, peace, and so forth. I want to add, with your permission, one thing that was mentioned earlier, I think deserves a spot of light on it. I think Senator Coleman spoke of the immigration from the Soviet Union and the help of America, the Jackson Vanik, and so forth. You know, in 1991, I'll tell you of a story. I was in the late 88, and another Republican regime, Reagan still in power. George Shultz is the Secretary of State, and I go with Shamir to meet George Shultz on strategic issues. In the end of the meeting, Shamir says to Shultz, you know, you have a rule that people who come out from Russia, from Soviet Union, can come to America and get, I think, green card or something. We saw that the Soviet Union was about to collapse, and there was a reservoir of millions, if not more, Jews who may come. And Shamir told him, you know, you insult me. Why do I insult you? Because you called them stateless. And he said, Shamir said to Schultz, after 48, there are no stateless Jews. They have a state. If they don't want to come here, let them come and go somewhere else. But the first choice should be Israel. Change the ruling and let those who come out come to Israel. And Schultz, and he mentioned it in memories, said, okay. And the rule was changed. And this is how we got about 1 million people to Israel. Now, one speaks of the importance of Israel, of the immigration to Israel, because the quality, because the numbers, because the economy, high tech. There's another element that goes back to what we said earlier about Israeli strength. The image of Israel not weakening, but having now more than 7 million Jews, more and more people coming, I think has had an important role in the acceptance of the Arabs that Israel is here to stay. It gets stronger with any Jews that's coming. So the importance of the American help to Israel in allowing Soviet Jews out and coming to Israel was not less important than the airlift and the other supply. So I go back to your question. I think Camp David was a major shift, turning point, and it continued. But as we say, and we know not all the Arabs are there. Iran came in, others tried to get nuclear. You remember Iraq, you remember Libya. Iran is there, so it's not over. But generally, I think we can see a very positive process that had to do with a very sound leadership in Israel, some Arab countries, and the American leadership is crucial here and should be awarded the thanks from all of us to what they are doing, and hopefully they will continue to do that.
The subject is infinite. Our time to discuss it is finite and at nearing an end. I wonder if we could, if each of the panelists would take a minute or two to sum up what lessons were learned, what lessons weren't learned from this period, from America and the Middle East in the 1970s, and whether any of those learned and or unlearned lessons are relevant at all today. Senator Coleman?
Yeah, I'd start just kind of mirroring what the minister said. Strength makes a difference. And I believe that the Arab countries want Israel to be successful in destroying Hamas because a weak Israel undermines in their own kind of sense of security. And I think if you look back, there was a miscalculation in '73, as there was a miscalculation in October 7th. And a terrible price has been paid. And so I think maintaining, that's the truth, that's one point. Second, is friends make a difference. And it's really important to be with your friends. And I give Richard Nixon great credit. I mean, truly saved Israel. Israel was facing an existential crisis at that point in time. They could have lost that war, and the world would have been a very different place. And so I give Richard Nixon on a personal level, which is my third point, is people make a difference. And they really did. Nixon would have, maybe God kind of puts him in that place at that time to do those things. I personally believe that. But Nixon was there and made a decision going beyond what Kissinger wanted to do. And I think as you look kind of to history, Sadat was there to kind of put himself at great risk, ultimately loss of life, to do what I think needed to be done. I think that still holds true today. And so at times you got to get beyond realpolitik. You got to get beyond what you even think is in the interest of your nation to what you think somehow is in the interest of something deeper. And I think hopefully if we remember those lessons, we'll have a brighter future.
I would like to focus on two, maybe three lessons. First of all, Israel must maintain its close alliance and close relationship with the U.S. The U.S.-Israeli alliance is crucial for Israel. It's a strategic asset that Israel should maintain and nurture. This goes back to Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin's vision in the early 90s when Rabin was campaigning and eventually won the June 92 elections in Israel. His vision stated the following. He said, Israel needs to prepare to the emergence of a strategic rival in the Middle East, whether it's a nuclear Iran, whether it's a refortified Saddam Hussein. Back in 92, Saddam Hussein was still in play. And in order to do that, Israel needs to strive to reach peace agreements with the neighbors in the first circle. So just, to continuing on from Egypt, right? Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and to figure out what to do on the Palestinian front to bolster relations with the US and to prepare to the emergence of that strategic threat. And I think he had it right. I think Israel has to double down on that, And the second point is that Israel would only be able to do that, and here I'm going to talk about the domestic Israeli arena. Israel would only be able to do that as long as it double downs on its democratic, liberal values. And Israel, that's not a liberal democracy, would not be able to enjoy such a relationship with the US and the Western world, and that is a strategic imperative for Israel.
Minister Meridor?
I would agree almost entirely with what Or Rabinovich said just now. Shared values were there, and we all face an attack on the basic values of democracy. You see populism not only in Israel, all over the world, the return of extremists. See what happens in some countries in Europe. I don't want to go into the American elections, of course, but even in Israel, attacks on the judicial system, attacks on democracy, they are bad in themselves, but in the terms of shared values, they are crucial, that we continue to be what we are and what we should continue to be. On top of that, I would say strategically, from 1973 and from October 7th last year, another lesson needs to be learned. We need to be very modest in appreciating how we can or cannot know what will happen. We have good intelligence, America has good intelligence, but there was Pearl Harbor. And there was attack of Kuwait on Iraq on Kuwait that nobody saw a day earlier, and things happened in October 7th. So need to be strong is not just to show strength, but because things may happen that you don't foresee in time. So Israel has to rebuild its strength after hopefully this crisis will come to an end, because there was some weakening of the position of Israel, the image of Israel, that is now being attacked from the Houthis and the Shiite militias and Hezbollah and Hamas in Iran. This is a change. I think we should go back to a situation where we don't need American soldiers fighting for us. We never wanted in the past. We need to strengthen ourselves. It has to do with strengthening Israel. And I would add what was said earlier. In time of strength, as I think we are a strong nation, this is the right time to solve outstanding issues. Postponing on end the issue is not an option. or it's a bad option. And the Israeli government needs to do something about it. I want to go to what we need to do. It's Israeli politics now. And even Iran, which emerges now as the other pole in this bipolar, so to speak, Middle East, in the end, there should be some arrangement. It has to do after Israel can negotiate or reshape the Middle East from a position of strength, not from weakness. There shouldn't be a conflict between Israel and Iran. There is one now, not by us. They changed the regime in '79, and we need to see how we come to terms with in the new Middle East. The world is changing rapidly. Those who were our enemies are friends. Those who were not enemies become enemies. And the war is different. It's not a war of armies. It's a war of drones and of missiles, not of conquering land. Things are changing very rapidly. So the basic strength and the flexibility politically and the need to change and to try to adapt yourself and rebuild Israel's strength and maintain our democracy is these values. And they are important, of course, in the axis of Israel and America. Nobody promises us. You may remember that until 1967 or 64, I think no American weapons were sold to Israel. The Israeli Air Force that won the 67 war was all French. So I don't know what will happen in the future. America is a solid ally, and we need to continue and develop those relationships and take into account whatever we can, the American and Israeli interest in the Middle East. It's good for both of us, provided Israel rebuilds its strength and maintains its character as a democratic state that we have been and we should stay.
And neatly, we end where we began with words from Ambassador Gal.
Well, my take is somewhat personal. Three very brief comments. The beautiful ceremony we saw on the South Lawn of the White House was, in my opinion, the culmination of two very, very strong leaders, Begin and Sadat, determined to seize the opportunity and to get their peoples towards peace. But no one should underestimate the role of the United States in helping them get there, be it a Republican administration or a Democratic president. So this is one. Second, every now and then I hear people complaining about the cold peace between Israel and Egypt. And I remember, and I apologize for being personal again, as a young officer, I was wounded in the war with Egypt and lost many of my friends. And I say to all of these people that the coldest peace in the world is still 1,000,000 times better than the most successful war. The fact that Israelis and Egyptians are not killing each other, this is something tremendous. This is something great. And third, last but not least, the relations between our two countries are very precious. They are precious to both sides, to Israel first and foremost, but to America as a partner. And we should all be very, very, very determined to keep the bipartisan nature of this relationship between Israel and America. And yes, Senator, I was the one to speak about commonality of values because, you know, interests are very interesting. I mean, sometimes you can share interests, sometimes you cannot, but value is something that is at the core of this relationship. And maybe just before I conclude, with your permission, I want to extend an invitation to the leadership of the Nixon Foundation to come and visit our Truman. Again, we don't play politics here at Truman and Nixon, but it's an open invitation for you to come and visit our outstanding university, especially at the year when we are celebrating 100 years of existence.
It was just renewed. So I want to thank all those online now and in the future for your interest and attention. And I want to thank everyone here in the East Room and ask you to join me in thanking this superb panel for such a terrific program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and see you in Jerusalem.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.